Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, we did a very interesting episode about the migration in cables for the USB cables. We're seeing so many products being launched, USB-C and USB-A to USB-C versus USB-C to USB-C. Sounds like a slightly different thing that, okay, we're moving to USB Type-C. But what was really interesting for me, at least, about that episode is that there's a really significant reason why, if you're looking to future-proof or get off this hamster wheel of buying cables that you then have to replace in a year, when you buy a new phone and it says we've got this great new charging standard that only works with USB-C, the one to stabilize on, and it's great you mentioned the power delivery is bringing some order to the manufacturer chaos that we've seen, is Type-C to Type-C, where that interconnect for negotiating the charge speed is present. And that's a really actionable purchasing tip, I think, for those looking to declutter, like what I'm doing now. And I'm going to be throwing all the Qualcomms in the bin, thanks to your episode. I figured that, going forward, I can do my best. Going backwards, there's no point hanging on to these old things if they're already useless. So I'd love to have a similar conversation, maybe to inform my decluttering efforts again, regarding monitor connection standards and display. We've got projectors, we've got computer screens, we've got all these things, TVs connecting to them. And the dominant and entrenched format is, of course, HDMI. But we see a lot of DisplayPort or DP coming in always in graphics cards, and especially, that I'm a big fan of these multi-monitor workstation setups, and often you'll see that the GPUs intended to support this use either DisplayLink or they use a mixture of DP and HDMI. And I often wonder, what's the point of mixing? I mean, choose one or the other. Which one is better? For monitors, it's nice to have this ability to control the brightness through software, especially if you're running a multi-monitor array. That actually becomes pretty important to be able to adjust the brightness and have the brightness or contrast reflected across all three of your, or however many screens you have. Likewise, if you're using a red light filter for blue light reduction, you don't want to have to manually set that on each screen. So that DPI layer, I think it's called, if I can recall. DCI, there's too many acronyms that we've covered, but that data communication layer is very useful. And I think it's something that we see more of. I've always had the impression that DP is better for that. The third type of connection for displays we're seeing much more of these days is USB Type-C itself. A lot of these smaller monitors, I got a couple of 7 inches for putting on stuff like the server, an IP camera, the router, just little displays in case it doesn't boot and you need to come up with a keyboard and figure out what's going on. You can get those if you look for AliExpress and Raspberry Pi parts for as cheap as $20 for $20 to $30 for one of those displays. And I think that for me makes them worth just having physically mounted to the side of the device. But they are often now using USB Type-C as the entire connection. It's Type-C to the SBC to the Raspberry Pi, and it's delivering both power and display. Sometimes I think I've seen that, but now that I say it, I'm not entirely sure. So Herman and Corin, what I got from that episode is that as much as these sound like the really boring details of computing and connecting, they actually, if you make smart choices, you can not only save money on buying inferior cables and connectors. If you are looking to get rid of all the stuff, if you've also gone off the deep end of technology like me, and you've got a stack of these cables and you're trying to figure out what's dead, I would say VGA and DVI can just be gotten rid of. But is anyone still using them out there, just out of curiosity? But let's focus mostly on the big ones, the standard ones, HDMI, DP, USB Type-C. What are their respective merits for connecting displays? And for those interested in that multi-display setup, and you're looking to make sure that the desktop syncs, and this is a minority of users, but a certain popular among the control centers we always talk about, gamers, there is a group of users that really want to have a nice multi-screen array with proper syncing, and the GPU is going to provide connectors. Which one are you looking? Which one would you recommend optimizing for? And finally, a cable is not just a cable. The thing people always neglect, whether we're talking about HDMI or DP, is to assume that any $2 cable from AliExpress is the exact same as any other cable. There is actually, it's not just marketing and people trying to get you to spend more money. There is a real difference between a well-manufactured and a poorly manufactured cable, especially from electrical isolation. So what would you recommend and that people look for when trying to pick one up? It doesn't have to be OEM, at least to the best of my knowledge, in displays. So we have the luxury of being able to choose third-party providers without feeling like we're breaking the warranty terms. But what would you recommend people look for, and whether they're getting a HDMI or DP, to make sure that they get something that's going to be good and not impair any of those signals? Over to you two.
Have you ever looked behind your desk and just felt a sense of impending doom? I was tidying up my workspace yesterday, trying to manage the literal nest of cables snaking out from my monitors, and it hit me how much we take these little plastic tip wires for granted. We just plug them in and expect pixels to appear, but the sheer amount of engineering and, honestly, the amount of confusion surrounding these standards is staggering. I found cables in my drawer that I could not even identify anymore. Some have the little screws on the side. Some are thin. Some are thick as a garden hose. And they all seem to promise the same thing, but deliver very different results.
It is a total minefield, corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have spent more hours than I care to admit reading white papers from the Video Electronics Standards Association and the HDMI Forum. It is February 22nd, 26, and you would think we would have solved the one cable dream by now, but if anything, the landscape has become even more fractured with the arrival of ultra-high bandwidth standards. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly this, the tangled world of monitor connection standards. He wants to know about the merits of HDMI, DisplayPort, and USB-C, especially when it comes to multi-monitor setups and syncing software controls like brightness or blue light filters across all those screens. Plus, he is asking the million-dollar question, what actually makes a cable good versus a cheap piece of junk that is going to degrade your signal?
It is a great topic because it is something almost everyone deals with, but very few people understand the underlying mechanics. We usually just grab whatever cable came in the box or whatever is cheapest on that big online retailer. But, as Daniel pointed out, if you're trying to do something sophisticated, like controlling 3 monitors simultaneously from your desktop without reaching for those clunky physical buttons on the bottom of the bezel, the choice of cable and standard actually matters a lot. I mean, have you ever tried to match the brightness on 3 different monitors using those little plastic buttons? It is a specialized form of torture.
It really is. You are clicking through menus trying to remember if brightness 50 on the left monitor matches brightness 42 on the right one because the panels are from different batches. And I think we should start by addressing that software control aspect first, because that is where a lot of people get frustrated. Most people think their monitor is just a passive output device, like a piece of paper that someone is drawing on very fast. But it is actually a two-way communication channel. Your computer is constantly talking to the monitor, and the monitor is talking back.
Right, and that communication usually happens through something called DDC/CI, which stands for Display Data Channel/Command Interface. I remember when I first discovered this, it felt like a superpower. I found a little utility called Monitorian, and suddenly I could use a slider on my taskbar to dim all 3 of my screens at once when the sun went down. But I noticed that on some setups, it works perfectly, and on others, the software just says, no compatible monitors found. Is that a limitation of the cable standard itself, or is it something else?
It is usually a combination of the monitor's internal hardware and how the graphics card handles that specific port. But the good news for Daniel is that DDC/CI is actually supported by HDMI, DisplayPort, and USB-C. It is part of the basic plumbing of all three standards. However, the way they implement it and the bandwidth they allocate for those sideband signals can vary. DDC/CI actually relies on an even older protocol called I2C, which is a simple serial bus. In the old days of VGA, we had specific pins dedicated to this. In modern digital cables, that data is interleaved or sent over specific auxiliary channels.
So if I'm using a DisplayPort cable versus an HDMI cable, should I expect a different experience with software syncing? Because I have definitely had moments where my HDMI monitor refused to play nice with my third-party brightness apps.
Generally, DisplayPort is the nerdier and more robust standard for this. It was designed from the ground up by the computer industry, whereas HDMI was born from the consumer electronics and television world. In a DisplayPort connection, there is a dedicated auxiliary channel that is specifically for this kind of non-video data. It handles things like link training, where the monitor and computer negotiate how much data they can send, but it also carries the DDC/CI commands. It is very reliable because it is a bidirectional half-duplex channel that operates independently of the main video stream.
And HDMI. Because I know HDMI has something called CEC, or Consumer Electronics Control. Is that the same thing? I use CEC to turn on my television with my Apple TV remote, but does that work for my PC monitor?
Not quite, and that is a common point of confusion. HDMI CEC is what allows your TV remote to turn on your soundbar or your PlayStation. It is great for the living room, but most computer monitors actually do not support CEC. Instead, they use the same DDC/CI protocol, but it is sent over the I2C pins in the HDMI connector. It works, but because HDMI was designed for a single source to a single display, it can sometimes get confused in complex multi-monitor setups, especially if you are using adapters or cheap splitters. If you are using an HDMI to DisplayPort adapter, for example, the DDC signal often gets lost in translation because the adapter doesn't know how to map the I2C lines to the DisplayPort auxiliary channel.
That brings us to the multi-monitor side of Daniel's prompt. This is where DisplayPort really starts to pull ahead, right? I am talking about daisy chaining. I remember the first time I saw someone plug a monitor into another monitor instead of the computer. It looked like black magic.
Exactly. This is officially called multi-stream transport, or MST. This is one of the biggest functional differences between DisplayPort and HDMI. With DisplayPort, starting with version 1.2, you can run one cable from your PC to monitor 1, and then another cable from monitor 1 to monitor 2. Your computer sees them as two distinct displays, and you can control them independently. HDMI simply cannot do this natively. If you use an HDMI splitter, you just get the same image mirrored on both screens. To get two different images over HDMI, you need two separate cables plugged into two separate ports on your graphics card.
Which is a nightmare for cable management. So, if Daniel is looking for the best multi-monitor experience where he can sync software controls, DisplayPort is the clear winner because of that robust auxiliary channel and MST support. But we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is Apple. I know a lot of people use MacBooks for their setups, and I have heard that daisy chaining doesn't work the same way there.
You hit on a very sore spot for Mac users. Even in 26, Mac OS does not support DisplayPort MST for daisy chaining. If you plug two monitors together via DisplayPort and plug them into a Mac, you will just get a mirrored image. Apple prefers a different technology called Thunderbolt. This is where USB-C comes into play. USB-C is actually just a physical connector shape, but it can carry many different types of data. When you connect a monitor via USB-C, it is almost always using something called DisplayPort Alt Mode. It is literally sending DisplayPort signals over the USB wires.
It sounds like the dream, but I have run into issues with USB-C cables where the video works, but the USB hub doesn't, or the charging is super slow. It feels like the weirdness of the prompt is really centered on the cables themselves. Why is it so hard to find a USB-C cable that just works for everything?
Because the USB-C cable is the most over-engineered and confusing piece of copper in human history. A single USB-C cable might support only USB 2.0 speeds and 60 watts of power, Or it might support USB 4 at 80 gigabits per second, 240 watts of power, and dual 8K video signals. And the kicker: they look identical from the outside. For Daniel's multi-monitor setup, if he is using a laptop, he wants a cable that is rated for at least USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4. These cables have active chips in the heads that tell the computer exactly what the cable is capable of.
So if he uses a high-quality USB-C or Thunderbolt cable, he gets the video, he gets the DDC/CI control for his brightness syncing, and he gets to charge his laptop all with one wire. That seems like the ultimate goal for a clean desk. But let us talk about the junk cables Daniel mentioned. We have all seen those 5-pack HDMI cables for $10. What is actually happening inside a cheap cable that makes it degrade the signal? I thought digital was just ones and zeros. It either works or it doesn't, right?
That is the great digital myth. While it is true that you won't get blurry video like you did with analog VGA, you can absolutely have a degraded digital signal. Think of it like a game of telephone. If I whisper a message to you and there is a loud vacuum cleaner running in the room, you might mishear a few words. In a digital cable, that vacuum cleaner is electromagnetic interference, or EMI. A cable is not just a bunch of copper wires anymore. For these high bandwidth standards, like HDMI 2.1 or DisplayPort 2.1, the cable is a highly engineered high-frequency transmission line.
We are talking about pushing billions of bits per second through tiny strands of metal. That is a lot of data.
It is an insane amount of data. HDMI 2.1b, which is the current standard, supports 48 gigabits per second. To put that in perspective, that is like trying to fire a fire hose through a straw. If the manufacturing is even slightly off, if the twists in the wire pairs aren't perfectly uniform, or if the shielding is thin, the signal gets smeared. Engineers call this jitter, or intersymbol interference. When the bits arrive at the monitor, they are so distorted that the monitor's brain can't tell if it's a 1 or a 0.
And that is when you get the sparkles, right? I have seen those little white dots flickering on my screen before.
Exactly. Sparkles are the first sign of a failing cable. It means some bits are being flipped. If it gets worse, you get handshake issues where the screen goes black for 3 seconds and then comes back. That is the monitor and the computer losing synchronization and trying to restart the connection. A cheap cable skimps on the shielding. A good cable has individual foil wrapping around each data pair, then another layer of foil around the whole bundle, and then a braided metal shield over that. It is like a fortress for your data.
So let us get into the specifics for Daniel. When he is looking at a listing for an HDMI or DisplayPort cable, what are the red flags and what are the green flags? Because they all look identical on the outside. They all have fancy nylon braiding and gold-plated connectors these days.
The first thing to look for is official certification. This is non-negotiable for high-performance setups. For HDMI, you want to see the ultra-high-speed label with a QR code that you can actually scan with an app from the HDMI licensing administrator. This ensures the cable has been tested in an authorized center to handle 48 gigabits per second. If a listing says supports HDMI 2.1 but doesn't mention the official certification, stay away. Anyone can print 2.1 on a box.
And for DisplayPort, I don't think I've ever seen a QR code on a DisplayPort box.
VESA, the group that manages DisplayPort, has a similar program, though they are a bit more low-key about it. Look for DP40 or DP80 certifications. These numbers correspond to the total bandwidth the cable can handle. A DP80 cable is rated for 80 gigabits per second, which is enough for 16K video or high refresh rate 8K. If you are just doing dual 4K at 60 Hz, a DP40 cable is plenty, but that certification is your guarantee that the cable was built to a specific standard of shielding and wire quality. You can actually go to the DisplayPort.org website and search for certified cables by brand.
You mentioned shielding earlier. That feels like one of those things marketing departments love to talk about, like triple shielded gold-plated connectors. Is the gold plating actually important, or is it just fluff to make the cable look expensive?
The gold plating is mostly fluff. Gold doesn't corrode, which is nice if you live on a boat or in a very humid environment, but the actual electrical contact is usually fine with nickel or tin. However, the shielding is absolutely critical. Think about all the electronic noise in your house. Your router, your phone, even the power cables behind your desk are all emitting electromagnetic interference. Because display signals are so high frequency, they are incredibly sensitive to this noise. A poorly shielded cable acts like an antenna, picking up all that junk and injecting it into your video signal.
I have actually had that happen. I had a cheap HDMI cable that would flicker every time my refrigerator's compressor kicked on. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought my graphics card was dying.
You weren't. That is a classic case of EMI. When the compressor kicks on, it sends a spike of interference through the air and the power lines. A well-manufactured cable will have individual shielding for each pair of data wires, usually a foil wrap, and then an overall braided shield around the entire bundle. This keeps the signal in and the noise out. When you buy a $2 cable from a random vendor, they are almost certainly skimping on that internal shielding to save money. They might just have a thin layer of foil and no braid at all.
What about the physical thickness of the cable? I have some cables that are so thick they are hard to bend, and others that are super thin and flexible. Is a thicker cable always better?
Generally, yes, but with a caveat. Thicker cables usually use a lower gauge of wire, meaning the copper strands are thicker. This is measured in AWG, or American Wire Gauge. For a long run, like a 15-foot cable, you want a lower AWG, maybe 28 or even 26, because thicker copper has less resistance and less signal loss over distance. But if the cable is too stiff, it can actually put a lot of physical stress on the ports of your expensive monitor or graphics card. I have seen HDMI ports literally ripped off the circuit board because a heavy cable was hanging off it for years.
That is a good point. I have seen people hang their heavy cables off their monitors, and over time, that can actually break the solder joints inside the board. So, you want quality, but maybe with some flexibility or a right angle adapter if space is tight. But wait, if the cable is too long, doesn't the signal just die out regardless of the thickness?
Exactly. This is where we get into the active versus passive distinction. For short runs under 10 feet, passive cables are fine. They are just wires, but for long runs, you might see active cables. These have a tiny chip in the connector that actually regenerates the signal to push it further. For really long runs, like 30 or 50 feet, you even see fiber optic HDMI or DisplayPort cables. These convert the electrical signal to light, which is immune to electromagnetic interference and doesn't degrade over distance.
Fiber optic display cables. That sounds like something you would use in a stadium, not a home office. Is there any benefit for a regular user, or is that just overkill?
If you are trying to run a 4K 144 Hz signal to a monitor on the other side of the room, a fiber optic cable is often the only way to get a stable connection. Copper just can't handle that much data over that distance without the signal turning into mush. If Daniel is setting up a large office where the PC is tucked away in a closet or a rack, he should definitely look into fiber optic cables. They are much thinner and easier to route too.
Let us circle back to the software control, because I think that is a really practical pain point for Daniel. If he has a mix of HDMI and DisplayPort monitors, he might find that his software works on one but not the other. Is there a way to force DDC/CI to work? I have been in those menus before, and they're not exactly user-friendly.
Sometimes you have to go into the monitor's own on-screen display menu, the physical buttons, and make sure DDC/CI is actually toggled to on. Some manufacturers ship them with it turned off to save a tiny amount of power or to prevent unauthorized changes. Also, if you are using a dock, especially a cheap USB-C dock, that dock might not pass the DDC commands through to the monitor. This is a very common failure point. The video signal gets through because it is high priority, but the control data gets stripped out by the dock's internal chip.
So if Daniel wants that seamless one slider to rule them all, experience for his brightness, he should probably try to connect his monitors directly to his GPU if possible, or use a very high quality Thunderbolt or USB-C dock that explicitly supports DDC/CI pass-through.
Precisely. Thunderbolt docks are generally much better at this than generic USB-C docks because Thunderbolt is essentially a direct extension of the computer's internal PCIe and DisplayPort lanes. It is much closer to plugging into the motherboard than a USB dock is. If you are on a Mac, you might want to look at an app called Lunar. It is specifically designed to handle these communication hurdles and can even sync brightness on monitors that don't support DDC/CI by using a software overlay, though the hardware method is always superior.
I want to talk about a misconception I see a lot. People often think that a more expensive cable will give them better colors or deeper blacks. We touched on this, but I want to be super clear for Daniel. If he buys a $50 cable, is his monitor going to look better than with a $15 certified cable?
The short answer is no. This is a point of huge debate in the audiophile and videophile communities, but the technical reality is that you don't get better colors from a better digital cable. You get a more stable signal. If a cable is on the edge of its capability, you might get sparkles, which are single pixels that are the wrong color because a bit got flipped. Or you might get momentary blackouts, but you won't get a sharper image or more vibrant reds. It is not like the old analog VGA days where a bad cable meant a blurry image or a ghosting effect. In the digital world, if the bits arrive, the image is perfect. If they don't, the image breaks.
So when a company sells a premium cable for $80 and claims it makes the colors pop, they are basically selling snake oil?
In terms of image quality, yes. But you might be paying for durability, better shielding, and the peace of mind that it actually meets the certification. I would never pay $80 for a 6-foot HDMI cable, but I also wouldn't pay $3. The sweet spot is usually around $15 to $25 for a certified cable from a reputable brand like Monoprice, Cable Matters, or Anchor. Those brands actually publish their test data, and they don't rely on magic claims about crystal-infused copper.
Those are good brands to mention. I have had great luck with them. Let us talk about the blue light filter, part of Daniel's prompt. Most people use something like Flux or the built-in Windows Nightlight or Mac's Night Shift. Those are purely software-based. They just change the colors the computer sends to the monitor. Does the cable standard even matter for that?
For those specific software solutions, no. The computer is just doing math on the pixels before they ever hit the wire. It says, okay, instead of sending pure white, I am going to send a slightly yellowish white. The cable doesn't care, it just carries the bits. However, some high-end monitors have a hardware, blue light filter, where the monitor itself adjusts its backlight or its color processing. To trigger that from your computer, you would need that DDC/CI communication we talked about. If Daniel wants the monitor's internal hardware to handle the blue light reduction, the cable choice becomes vital again.
That is an important distinction. Software-based filters can sometimes make things look a bit washed out because they are just messing with the gamma and the color balance. Hardware-based filters on the monitor are usually much more pleasant to look at because they can actually adjust the physical backlight spectrum.
Exactly. And that brings up another interesting point about multi-monitor setups. If you have 3 different monitors, even from the same brand, they often have slightly different color casts out of the box. One might look a bit more yellow, one a bit more blue. If you are using software to sync them, you really want that DDC/CI control so you can fine-tune the RGB gains on each monitor individually from your desktop until they match perfectly. Doing that with a mouse and a slider in an app like ClickMonitor DDC is so much better than using the physical buttons.
I've spent hours doing that with physical buttons, and it is a nightmare. You change the red on one, then you realize the green is off on the other, and you're just bouncing back and forth. Okay, so we have covered HDMI versus DisplayPort, the importance of certification, the role of DDC/CI, and why USB-C is basically just DisplayPort in disguise. What about the older stuff? Daniel mentioned VGA and DVI. Are those officially dead in 26?
For anyone who cares about their eyes and their sanity, yes. VGA is analog, which means it is susceptible to every kind of interference imaginable. DVI is digital and actually uses the same signaling as HDMI, but it is bulky and lacks all the modern features like audio, power delivery, and high-speed data. If you have a monitor that only has VGA or DVI, it is probably time to look for an upgrade, or at the very least, a very good active adapter to convert it to a modern standard. But be warned, those adapters almost always break DDC/CI communication.
I think a lot of people are still using DVI because it was so ubiquitous on office monitors for a decade. But you're right, the lack of features makes it a dead end. Let us talk about the future for a second. We are starting to see DisplayPort 2.1 and HDMI 2.1b. What is coming next that might solve some of these headaches? Or is it just going to get more complicated?
The big push right now is for even more bandwidth and better compression. There is a technology called DSC, or Display Stream Compression. It is visually lossless, meaning you can't see the difference, but it allows you to squeeze a massive amount of data through a smaller pipe. This is how we are getting things like 4K at 240 Hz over a single cable. In the future, we might see even more integration with USB 4 version 2.0, where the distinction between a data cable and a video cable completely disappears. We are looking at 80 or even 120 gigabits per second over a single USB-C connector.
That would be the dream. Just one cable that does everything, and you don't have to worry about whether it is alt mode or Thunderbolt or high speed. But we are not there yet. We are still in the world where you have to check the little icons next to the ports.
No, we are definitely in the transitional chaos phase, which is why Daniel's question is so relevant. Right now, you still have to be a bit of a detective. You have to look at the spec sheet of your monitor, the spec sheet of your graphics card, and then find the one cable that bridges them correctly. It is not just plug and play anymore. It is verify, then plug, then pray.
Okay, so if we were to give Daniel a checklist for his next monitor and cable purchase, what would be on it? Let us summarize the key takeaways.
Number 1. If you are doing a multi-monitor setup on a PC, prioritize DisplayPort. It is more flexible, supports daisy chaining via MST, and has a more robust auxiliary channel for software control. Number 2. If you are using a laptop, look for a monitor with USB-C power delivery and a cable rated for at least USB 4. It simplifies your life immensely by turning your monitor into a dock. Number 3. Never buy an uncertified cable. Look for the ultra high-speed HDMI sticker with the QR code or the DP80 VESA certification.
And number 4. Check your monitor's menu to ensure DDC/CI is enabled if you want to use software controls. I would also add, number 5, don't overspend on audiophile grade display cables. Stick to the reputable prosumer brands that provide actual test data and certifications. You want a cable that is built well, not one that is marketed with magic.
Exactly. And if you are running a long cable, anything over 10 feet, consider spending a bit more for an active or fiber optic cable to ensure you don't get those annoying flickering issues. Also, pay attention to the version numbers. If you buy a high-speed HDMI cable, it only supports 10.2 gigabits per second. That won't even do 4K at 60 Hz with full color. You need premium high speed for 18 gigabits or ultra high speed for 48.
It is funny how these tiny details, like the thickness of a copper wire or the way a connector is shielded, can have such a huge impact on our daily work life. I think about all the people out there struggling with flickering screens or blurry text, and half the time it is just a $5 cable that isn't up to the task.
It is the invisible infrastructure of our digital world. When it works, you don't even think about it. When it doesn't, it is the most frustrating thing in the world because it feels like it should be simple. But as we have seen, there is a massive amount of physics and engineering trying to keep those billions of bits moving in the right direction.
This has been really illuminating, Herman. I think I need to go back behind my desk and check if my cables are actually certified, or if I am just living on the edge of signal integrity. I might have some high-speed cables trying to do ultra-high-speed jobs.
We all do, Corn. I recently found a cable from 2010 that I was trying to use for a 4K monitor, and I wondered why the screen was turning purple every 20 minutes. It turns out that cable just didn't have the bandwidth to handle the color depth I was asking for.
Well, hopefully, this helps Daniel and everyone else out there clear up some of the cable clutter, both physically and mentally. It is a complex topic, but once you know what to look for, it gets a lot easier to manage. You don't need to be an electrical engineer. You just need to know how to read a label and check a menu setting.
Absolutely. And honestly, once you get that software syncing working and you can dim all your monitors with one keystroke or have them automatically adjust to the ambient light in your room, you will never want to go back. It is one of those small quality of life improvements that makes a big difference in reducing eye strain and making your workspace feel more cohesive.
For sure. Well, I think that covers the bulk of the monitor connection madness. It is a deep rabbit hole, but a fascinating one. we didn't even get into the pinouts of the connectors, but I think we should probably spare the listeners that level of detail for now.
I could talk about the transition, minimize differential signaling, and the way the clock signal is embedded in the data streams for another hour, but you are right, let us keep it practical. The goal is to get the pixels on the screen and the sliders working.
Yeah, let us save the clock signals for the after show. If you have been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other people discover the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into these weird prompts. We are coming up on our 50th episode soon, and we have some big things planned.
It really does. We love seeing those reviews pop up, especially when people tell us about the weird tech problems they solved. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including our deep dive into USB standards and the history of the floppy disk, at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there for subscribers and a contact form if you want to send us your own weird prompts.
You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you get your audio fix. We are always looking for new topics, so don't be shy. If you have a question about why your printer makes that specific grinding noise, or why your Wi-Fi dies when you use the microwave, send it in.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of My Weird Prompts. It has been a blast as always. I am going to go home and reorganize my cable drawer now.
Good luck with that, Herman. I expect a full report on how many VGA cables you find. We will be back soon with another deep dive into whatever Daniel or the rest of you send our way. Until then, keep your cables tidy and your signals strong.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.